Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome back to Season 3 of the Logical Christian Podcast. I'm your Logical Christian, Dan Irwin. The Logical Christian Podcast is not here to tell you what to think. It's an exercise in how to think. Rather than just accept what we're being told with regard to current events, politics, science, religion, and everything else, we're going to stop the spin, ask questions, dive deep, and look at the world logically. And since logic is a gift from God, most importantly, we're going to look at it all as Christians. Links can be found in the show notes if you'd like to follow along. So with that, let's go be logical Christians. In a 2015 interview, if you recall, Donald Trump said that he gets Bibles sent to him by supporters just all of the time, that he doesn't throw them away, right? He can't do that. He puts them in a very nice room. And one of the cries of Christians across the country at that time was, "Do you read any of them?" Well, the Bible Society does a poll every year called the State of the Bible. One of the questions they ask is about Bible use. They use the broadest definition possible: interaction with the Bible, a Bible app, listening to Bible audio, etc., at least 3 to 4 times per year, not counting church services. That counts as someone who uses the Bible. Well, from 2011 to 2021, that percentage of Americans that fit into that pretty pitiful criteria held steady at about 50%. In 2022, that number fell to 40%, 39% in 2023, and 38% in 2024. So, no, Trump probably isn't or wasn't reading them, and it appears today that almost nobody is. On today's episode, first we're going to learn the more accurate definition of Papal Bull, then we'll create things out of thin air, and finally we're going to assume some assuming assumptions. Although, to be fair, this theme of not reading the Bible doesn't apply to the final segment. I just want to be clear. So, put on those hip waders. It's going to get deep. Then get a good pen. You're going to have a lot of updates to make in the margins. And finally, books. Well, a book. And now at this point in our program, if I read this correctly, yes, I do. Here we go. So the Catholic Church makes the claim that the Apostle Peter was the first pope. I'd guess that most Christians have at least heard that before. If you look up popes and the popery, it appears that right at the end of the 4th century, with the installation of Siricius, maybe, that a title akin to pope was first used. In the year 1517, Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the door of the Wittenberg Church, a list of items that Luther felt were points that the Catholic Church had strayed from in the Bible and that needed to be corrected. Problem is that the Church, the leadership, had no interest in correcting these because to do so would rip power and control and their financing, really, away from the Church, as well as creating other perceived issues. With the Protestant Reformation and the fracturing of the Catholic, small c, or universal Church, we now have the Protestant Church and the Catholic, large c, Church. Although some things have been corrected since the time of the Reformation, the Catholic Church is still kind of a mess. Now, I know we shouldn't judge, but here's the thing. That's not a biblical statement. Of course we're supposed to judge, or more accurately, we're supposed to make judgments based on what we see or hear or read and understand. The reality is that if you ask a typical adherent to Catholicism if they're saved, they'll typically answer something along the lines of, "I don't know," or "I hope so," or "I'm trying." And from a Catholic point of view, well, that's absolutely correct. They really don't know because they can't know. Most of them hope that they are, but they won't really know that until they die, at which point they'll be tormented for a varying number of years or millennia or whatever anyway in purgatory, even if they are saved, and purgatory also isn't biblical. Now, although I'd like to go through the differences between Protestantism and Catholicism, the unbiblical problems that makes Catholicism only slightly more Christian than other cults, like Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnessism, or the points of Luther's 95 Theses, I'd like to go through that too. The reality is it's not the direction we're heading, and I'm not sure that we'd even have time to do that if I wanted to, at least not in one segment. That's not where we're heading today. Now, I bring all this up because today the Catholic Church says that we're currently on Pope number 266. Now, if we were to start with Siricius, that would remove the first 37 so-called popes, bringing the total to 229 popes. So today we're at a large number of popes. That's all I'm saying. As a side note, and I like math, I was curious. If you start with the Apostle Peter, the average tenure of a pope is 7.5 years. the pope with the longest reign, discounting Peter, Peter was not a pope. I know they claim him, he was not a pope. So discounting Peter, the pope with the longest reign was Pius the Ninth, who reigned 31 years, 7 months, and 23 days from 1846 to 1878. The shortest reign was Urban VII, who reigned for 13 days in September of 1590. So each one of these popes is considered to be the mouthpiece of Christ. With some clarification, we're to understand that in official matters, the pope speaks the words of Christ. In unofficial matters, the words are the pope's alone. This is important to keep in mind, I guess. Although, to be honest, it probably doesn't matter because, look, if a pope goes off the rails a bit, his staff can just say that, he wasn't speaking officially for Christ. He was just speaking as himself, or vice versa, or whatever. Just ignore him, right? Now, let's all agree that that kind of caveat would come in really handy. Just all of the time. Oh, I know I said that, but it was spoken in an unofficial way, so, just ignore it. So unless you follow specific news websites, I highly doubt you've heard this story yet, but found on notthebee.com, headline, Pope Francis to children, all religions are paths to reach God. Some are Sikh, Muslim, Hindu, Christians, they are different ways to God. And as Bart Simpson said, which has become an oft-used meme at this point, what an odd thing to say. If I searched for this story just right, I could find an article on ABC News. That's if I put in the search terms just perfectly into the Googler, right? Although I doubt that ABC put this on their nightly news. I don't know. I don't watch it. But their article was entitled something slightly different. Quote, Pope ends Asia trip with same message at the start. Interfaith tolerance to heal troubled world. Interfaith tolerance. Look, I have no problem, as our founders didn't, with the free practice of religion. You can worship anything or any way you want as long as you have the same tolerance for my freedom and your religion doesn't infringe upon or harm me in any way. That said, will interfaith tolerance heal the troubled world? No, it won't. I would argue that worshiping false gods rather than worshiping the one true God would ultimately lead to probably to more problems. Unless, of course, Christianity and Judaism were eliminated, in which case I think Satan would probably be fine with peace on earth because everyone would be worshiping him then. Back to the story. So I'm going to jump off not the bee and go straight to the horse's mouth. And by horse, I mean the Pope. He just wrapped up a tour of Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Timor-Leste, probably said that right, and Singapore. This was a nearly 2-week trip spanning from September 2nd to September 13th, and I'll just say that looking at his schedule, knowing that he's only a few months shy of 88 years old, with known health issues for a number of years now, look, I applaud him for what he was able to do. Over those nearly 2 weeks, he was pretty much non-stop from the 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. almost every day with some slight variation day to day with some flights, and he had mass multiple times and was sitting in ceremonies, gave small speeches multiple times a day, etc., just all day, every day. However, for as much credit as I can give him for his stamina, I can't give him any credit for the specific talk that he gave to some children to wrap up his tour, or as it turns out, his other talks, for that matter. So I went to the Vatican's website, vatican.va. I guess they get their own dot thing of their own there, right? It's whatever. And I found his schedule for this trip, which links to many of the event pages, many of those having links to the transcripts of his speeches, and I read a number of his speeches to see what exactly he had to say. I was not impressed. The nice thing is that for as much stamina as he showed, his speeches or talks or remarks or what have you, well, those are all relatively short. So that was nice. I appreciate that. Now, I wanted to touch on a handful of his talks, whatever, because it's important to know that this Pope didn't just misspeak. He's theologically compromised, which I think a lot of us knew already. And this isn't anything new. He's clearly been a socialist-minded individual his entire life, which is, again, not biblical, and that's not a Christian worldview. So, Anyway, let's start walking through his schedule and briefly touch on some of the remarks he made at various locations. Well, after a day of travel and a day to mostly rest up, but don't blame him, he started his tour. On day 2, he was in Jakarta. And the first thing in the morning, he had an, quote, interreligious meeting in the Istiqlal Mosque. And this, Your Honor, is where the problems began. He, a Catholic, a supposed Christian, was, quote, happy to be here in the largest mosque in Asia, together with all of you. I greet the grand imam and thank him for his words, reminding us that this place of worship and prayer is also a great house for humanity, where everyone can enter and take time for themselves in order to make space for that yearning for the infinite that each one of us carries in our hearts, and to seek an encounter with the divine and experience the joy of friendship with others. So everyone can enter, is what we're told here. I wonder how many Jews were there that day. I scanned through the video as some young, mostly covered Muslim woman was screeching some sort of call to prayer or something. And look, I'm sorry. That is just unlistenable. Yes, I know some may be offended by me saying that, but wow, is that bad. It was so bad. Anyway, they panned the crowd multiple times. I didn't see anyone who looked Jewish. Just saying. They did show a close-up of the Pope a few times, and while she was screeching her thing, he was clearly enduring this, and he had a bad case of resting Pope face. I'm just going to say that. But all that appeared to be there were Catholics and Muslims. Seems like they're just barely scratching the interreligious part of that meeting, right? I mean, that's just 2. Anyway, the Pope goes on to mention the fact that this was apparently a Christian man who won the design competition to design the mosque. So, quote, this testifies to the fact that throughout the history of this nation and in the very fabric of its culture, the mosque, like other places of worship, are spaces of dialogue, mutual respect, and harmonious coexistence between religions and different spiritual sensibilities. Not sure that a designer says that, but okay. The Pope then mentions a tunnel called the Tunnel of Friendship. I think he dedicated the tunnel. It runs about 100 feet underground, and it connects the Istiqlal Mosque and the Cathedral of St. Mary of the Assumption. This was done for reasons of unity between the two faith systems, and also to allow the adherents of either faith to use the parking lot of the other and walk through the tunnel to the house of worship of their choice, because apparently parking is kind of at a premium around there, so they're just kind of working together. He praised the fact that there could be encounters in that tunnel that would lead to dialogue, a sharing, a solidarity, a fraternity betwixt the two religions. Quote, I encourage you to continue along this path so that all of us, together, each cultivating his or her own spirituality and practicing his or her religion, may walk in search of God and contribute to building open societies founded on reciprocal respect and mutual love, capable of protecting against rigidity, fundamentalism, and extremism, which are always dangerous and never justifiable. So fundamentalism, along with extremism, is always bad. Really? It's always dangerous, never justifiable. Are you sure about that, Your Popeness? Because the definition of fundamentalism with regard to religion is basically believing what you purport to believe. If you believe in something, you should be a fundamentalist. You shouldn't be an extremist, but you should be a fundamentalist. You should believe what you say you believe. Now, he said that in each of the buildings, there are specific spaces that are important to the specific faith, but in the tunnel, there could be intermingling and dialogue, and that's how we should look at our faith. There will always be core aspects, quote, rites, practices, and so on, that must be protected, but underneath all that is a, quote, quest for an encounter with the divine, the thirst for the infinite that the Almighty has placed in our hearts, the search for a greater joy, and a life stronger than any type of death, which animates the journey of our lives and impels us to step out of ourselves to encounter God. And because of this, quote, we discover that we are all brothers and sisters, all pilgrims, all on our way to God, beyond what differentiates us. But the problem is we're not all brothers and sisters on our way to God. I'd argue that the vast majority of Catholics, and I would argue that all Muslims, are on their way to something, and it will be an encounter with God, just not how he's saying and without the desired end result. But citing the title of some declaration or agreement that was drawn up for this occasion, he said, quote, "Dear brothers and sisters, fostering religious harmony for the sake of humanity is the path that we are called to follow." And is it? I mean, I absolutely believe in freedom of religion, but by being harmonious with our so-called brothers and sisters just trying to find God, aren't we ignoring the fact that we're harmoniously sending people to hell because we don't want to rock the boat? Jumping forward a couple days, we come to September 9th. His Popishness is now in Port Moresby, the capital city of Papua New Guinea, which appears to be somewhere around a 10-hour journey or so from where he left. Side note, did you know that the Pope doesn't have his own Pope plane? I kind of thought he would. Apparently he charters a plane when he travels. He travels with a relatively small entourage, typically a press pool, and so the size of the airplane depends on where he's going, for how long, and who's traveling with him. Anyway, Pope-based digression. So he left Jakarta in the morning of September 6th, got to Port Moresby that evening, piddled around doing whatever, popey things for a few days, and at 9:45 on the morning of September 9th, he met with, quote, young people in the Sir John Guy's Stadium. Now, Mr. Pope starts his remarks with saying that he wanted to meet with the young people because they are the future. Then he broke into a tear-jerking rendition of Greatest Love of All that would put Whitney Houston to shame. I believe the children are our future. Teach them well and let them lead the way. Show them all the beauty they possess inside. Right? Okay, maybe not. But could you imagine if he did? That would have been awesome. So he begins his message with the retelling of the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. Sort of. Hang with me here. Quote, "There we see two models clashing, two opposing ways of living and of building a society. One leads to confusion and dispersion. The other leads to the harmony of encounter with God and with our brothers and sisters. Confusion on one side and harmony on the other. This juxtaposition is important. I ask you now, what do you choose? The model of dispersion or the model of harmony? Which one do you choose?" And the young people answered him, "Harmony. You are good. Scripture tells us that after the flood, Noah's descendants dispersed to different islands, each with their own language, by their families. Without removing their differences, God granted them a way to communicate with each other and thus find unity. In fact, the whole earth had one language. This means that the Lord created us in order to have good relations with others. Be careful. He did not create us for confusion, but to have good relationships. This is very important." Now, I'd like to stress, these are prepared remarks. Like, he wrote them, or someone wrote them. This was read. He read this off of a piece of paper with the words printed on there that someone put there. And you're telling me that nobody said, Your Holiness, would you like me to read you Genesis 8 and the first 9 verses of Genesis 11? Just for your familiarity with the account of the end of the flood and the Tower of Babel, because it seems like you may need a refresher. Not one person thought to tell him that what he was going to say not only was incorrect, but it made no sense whatsoever, even in its incorrectness. Now, I'm not even going to try to hash that one out for you. You can skip back a few minutes and listen to it over and over and over if you'd like. I read it multiple times. I have no idea what he was trying to say, but his point was to have good relationships. That's where he was heading. So, look, he got there. So the way to good relationships between all people is to speak the same language, love. And although hate is against love, even worse is indifference, not caring what happens to others. And look, I agree. At least with hate, there's an emotion. You actually feel something about a person. But with indifference, you don't care at all. That's why indifference is the opposite of love. The Pope then tells them that there is a very important relationship that must be fostered, that between children and grandparents. Then he makes them repeat after him, quote, "Long live grandparents," which, okay. He then asks the kids if kids can make mistakes, if adults, and then if old persons like him can make mistakes. And the kids respond yes to all of those. Then he says that it's important to recognize mistakes. Okay. And then he says that if one falls down, the most important thing is to get back up. Then continuing to build on his example, if one of them encounters someone who is down, who has fallen down, quote, is a little down in moral life, he asks them if they should laugh at them or give them a smack. And no, apparently I've been doing this wrong the entire time. We're actually supposed to help that person back up. Stop smacking people. Then he thanks them. They all recite the Lord's Prayer. Then he breaks, saying that he forgot one thing. If someone falls, should they stay down? And the kids answer no. And if we see someone who has fallen, should we leave that person or give them a smack? And they respond no. And I feel like we've been through this before, but he felt like he forgot it. Then there was a blessing of some sort, then after the blessing, but before the final song, he breaks in yet again and says that he forgot to say something, at which point he asks them if they find someone who has fallen down, should we kick them? And the kids say no, and then he says, and what do we do when we find someone who has fallen? And the kids respond, get back up, which isn't exactly the correct answer per the way the question was phrased, but they're probably as confused as you and I are, being completely thrown off balance from the very beginning with whatever that Tower of Babel story was supposed to be. Ugh. Okay, reserving comment until the end. So he left late that morning from Port Moresby, took a relatively short flight to Dili, D-I-L-I, which per Google either stands for drug-induced liver injury or is the capital of, and say it with me here, Timor-Leste. Yep, you got it. The next morning, September 10th, he visited the children with disabilities of the Irmis Alma School. He starts this one with confusion just right out of the gate. Quote, "There's one thing that always makes me think. When Jesus talks about the final judgment, he says to some people, 'Come with me,' but he does not say, 'Come with me because you are baptized, because you were confirmed, because you were married in the church, because you did not lie, because you did not steal.' No, he says, 'Come with me because you took care of me.' Jesus says, 'Come with me because you took care of me when I was hungry, and you gave me food when I was thirsty, and you gave me drink, and when I was sick, and you visited me,' and so on. I call this the sacrament of the poor, a love that encourages, that edifies, it strengthens." Except that, that's not exactly true. We're supposed to do this. We're supposed to take care of those in need, but that's not why we, at the final judgment, are allowed to go with Jesus. Now, the Pope is referencing Matthew 25, where Jesus is speaking of the final judgment. He's got that right. The nations are being gathered together before him, separating the sheep and the goats. Salvation, or not, has already been determined at this point. That's not what Jesus is speaking of here. If he was, well, that would completely contradict the rest of the Bible, making Christianity just another religion of works, which it is not. No, Jesus is speaking of the works that are evidence of salvation, like James speaks of in chapter 2 of his namesake book. Quote, "What use is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith, but he has no works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothing and in need of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and be filled,' and yet you do not give them what is necessary for their body, what use is that? Even so, faith, if it has no works, is dead by itself. But someone will say, 'You have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I will show you my faith by my works.'" See, works are the outward expression of our salvation by faith through grace. And just another shiny object moment here. Notice that both of these passages speak of those in need as our brothers and sisters. As Christians, our obligation on this earth is first to our family, second to our fellow Christians, our brothers and sisters, and lastly to everyone else. People really like to take, especially those words of Jesus, out of context and say that a church must be socially active in their community. But that's not what either of those passages are saying. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I would argue it's a good thing to do as long as the members of your church or your denomination or your faith, and you can decide how far that sphere should extend, as long as those needs are taken care of first. Okay, so His Popeness says that in order to do this, we must love. He says that, quote, "This is how we come to understand the love of Jesus, who gave his life for us. We cannot understand the love of Jesus unless we start to practice love." I'd very cautiously say that sort of sounds okay, sort of right. It's not completely wrong. I can go there. He then says that in order to learn how to care for others, we need to let ourselves be cared for. And yeah, again, cautiously, I think there is benefit to experiencing what we want to do. Some of the best addiction counselors, for example, are those who have been counseled and worked their way out of addiction. But then he says that we need, quote, to let ourselves be cared for by God, who loves us so much, to let ourselves be cared for by Our Lady, who is our mother. And then after the blessing and some other pomp, papal pomp, if you will, he says, quote, this is the gift that I am leaving to this house. Pay attention. St. Joseph takes care of Our Lady, and Our Lady takes care of Jesus. The most important one is the one who lets himself be cared for the most, Jesus. He lets himself be cared for by Mary and Joseph. And no, not since Jesus was on this earth and a child did that happen. But this is the Catholic way. They claim to not worship idols, but they absolutely worship Mary and so many others, which are our idols. Mary and Joseph are not caring for little baby Jesus up in heaven. They exist because Jesus wills them to exist. They're both in heaven because of their faith, at least in Joseph's case, Old Testament faith, and ultimately the sacrifice, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus cares for them. Jesus cares for all humanity through common grace, and Jesus cares for his elect, all the Father gives him. Jesus does not require someone to take care of him. The next morning, September 11th, still either in liver failure or in the capital city, Dili, not sure which, he met with young people in Centro de Convencues, which I think translates to the center of the conveyors, so he must be in an underage manufacturing sweatshop of some sort, probably Apple or Nike. After doing a little Google Translate action there, I guess it means convention center, so whatever, come see, come saw. He starts his remarks by asking questions of the kids, asking for responses, and this is absolutely the same thing that happens in elementary age Sunday school classes around the world. Doesn't matter the question, the answer is Jesus, and if that's wrong, you can try God or the devil or maybe sin. The teacher must be looking for a standard answer. So the Pope asks them the completely open-ended question, quote, what do young people do? He gets the answer of proclaim Christ, and that's fine. Then he gets proclaim the word of God, and sure. Another kid offers love one another, and absolutely, he says we do that. And then an overachiever says, quote, we must cultivate peace in our country. Okay, Poindexter, sit down. Whew. But none of those are what the Pope was looking for. He gives them the answer, quote, do you know what young people always do? They make a mess. Yeah, see, he was never going to get there from here. They could have sat there all day, and that was not going to be an answer he was going to get. The Pope then goes into a just say no to drugs commercial. He says that they should stay away from drugs and from alcohol. And then he wanders into something about how old people are valuable. They have wisdom, which is true. I'm not arguing that point. Just not sure how he got there exactly. And that the greatest treasure of a society are the children and the old people. And I'm not going to lie, a little offended over here. Then he pivots and says that their country has a great history, which includes reconciliation, and that Jesus was our brother who wants us all together and leads to freedom, commitment, and fraternity. And then he moves back into addiction talk and then talks about mobile phones briefly, as opposed to a young person who is committed and works hard and loves his brothers and sisters, loves their country. He should also be committed to family and help around the house. He's kind of all over the board, if you're not getting the point here. Then he moves into fraternity, specifically respect. Quote, I ask you, is it good for young people to have different ideas? For what reason? To fight with others or to respect each other? I think this is what you think. If I belong to this religion and you belong to that other religion, we are going to argue. It is not like that. We must respect each other. He says that love and service are the most important thing. Makes them repeat that, actually. Then out of nowhere, he moves into bullying. He even says that he doesn't know if it happens there, but it happens other places. So, quote, bullying is an attitude of taking advantage of the weakest. Someone may be bullied because he or she is ugly or fat or walks badly. However, this is always a bad attitude because it preys on the weaknesses of others. And again, I'm kind of offended here. I'm threefold offended based on that statement. But he tells them not to bully. As he wraps up, he says that we, quote, have to love each other beyond all ethnic or religious differences. And again, look, very cautiously, yes, I agree with those words in that order, but I don't think I agree with the way that he means that statement. Then he gives them 2 pieces of advice. Very important. First, make a mess. Second, respect the elders. So I guess just don't worry about the whole addiction thing, or the bullying thing, or the phone thing. Just out of all of that, everything he said, just make a mess and respect old people. And I'll be honest, the elders were what my parents were to me, and making a mess was the bad thing. So which one do I do? Anyway, doesn't matter. Finally, we move to the last day of the trip. He's now in Singapore, having arrived in the afternoon of September 11th from Dili. His second stop of the day is the Catholic Junior College, where he holds an interreligious meeting with young people. So we've come full circle, as this is where the segment started with the headline from Not the Bee. The difference in these remarks is that apparently the Pope did not use the prepared remarks. Rather, he spoke impromptu. Now, based on what some of the other speakers and what some of the students said leading to his remarks, he said that yes, young people must be careful not to be critical. They should be critical thinkers, but not critical of others. He said that they must be willing to get out of their comfort zones. Quote, a young person who chooses always to spend his or her time in comfort is a young person who becomes fat. Not fatter in body, but fatter in mind. That is why I say to young people, take risks. Go out. Do not be afraid. Fear is a dictatorial attitude that paralyzes you. Then he goes on to speak about how we all make mistakes, and young people make a lot of mistakes, so he totally missed the opportunity to speak about fear from a biblical worldview, and then he moved into mistakes, not sins, just mistakes. Then he addressed media. He basically said that careful usage, moderate usage of forms of media, and he was speaking of electronic devices as well here, is a good thing. Young persons should neither shun all forms of media nor be addicted to it. Okay, I can agree with that. Then it goes off the rails. Quote, one of the things that has impressed me most about the young people here is your capacity for interfaith dialogue. This is very important because if you start arguing, my religion is more important than yours, or mine is the true one, yours is not true, where does this lead? Somebody answer. And then a young person answers, destruction. That is correct. All religions are paths to God. I will use an analogy. They are like different languages that express the divine, but God is for everyone, and therefore we are all God's children. But my God is more important than yours. Is this true? There is only one God, and religions are like languages, paths to reach God. Some Sikh, some Muslim, some Hindu, some Christian. Understood? Yet interfaith dialogue among young people takes courage. The age of youth is the age of courage, but you can misuse this courage to do things that will not help you. Instead, you should have courage to move forward and to dialogue. He then moves into having respectful interactions and dialogue to eschew bullying. And why? Well, respect helps you have your interfaith dialogue with others. Then he goes through a process of thanking people and praying, I guess to whatever God, or the one God that's the God of all religions or something. I'm really not sure at this point. It used to be that if you asked someone an obvious question, you'd get a response like, is the Pope Catholic? And with the introduction of Pope Benedict and now Pope Francis, and I'm sure it's been collapsing for much longer than that, Catholics started asking that same question, is the Pope Catholic? Because I don't feel like we're on the same page anymore. And now I'd be willing to argue that yes, this Pope is in fact Catholic. The Catholic faith is experiencing what so many other denominations are experiencing, entropy, decay, a crumbling from order to chaos. Now, just as not all Catholics are unsaved, I guarantee there's a small percentage of Catholics that are saved. I also believe that not all Catholics are on board with the absolute heresy that this Pope has introduced in preference of his social gospel. And not just heresy, but look at how many opportunities he had to speak to young people about this world, the temptations, the evil, the pain, and how he never mentioned the gospel. He never mentioned sin or repentance. He only once mentioned the blood of Christ, and he totally screwed that up. And yes, I know, I didn't read all of his other transcripts to various groups and congregations from this trip, but should we have any reason to think that he did anything different with anyone else? And then the coup de grace, speaking off the cuff, saying exactly what he believes to be true, that all religions lead to God. Or more accurately, there's only one God, and he is the God of all religions. So people may seek him in different ways, but they're all seeking the same God, and in the end, we'll all end up in the same place. Now, why would he say this? He, arguably one of the most powerful faith leaders in the world, regardless of if you follow him or agree with him or not, that's simply a fact. Why would he, someone who is speaking for Christ, or maybe this is one of those caveat times, knowing that Jesus himself said that he is the way, the truth, and the life, and that no man comes to the Father but by me? Why would he say these things? Jesus said something that is oddly specific right there, incredibly limited and unbelievably controversial and unpopular with the majority of the world, then and now. So whether the Pope is Catholic or not, whether Catholics are Catholic anymore or not, what we can say for sure is that the Pope is not Christian. The Pope is not saved. As of right now, in the final months, maybe of his life, he's currently bound for hell. And by his very words, going into regions of Christianity, Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, telling them that all roads lead to God, well, he's complicit in their condemnation to an eternity in hell as well. But this is why he said not to be a fundamentalist. In other words, don't be such a stuffy, judgmental fuddy-duddy. Just everyone get along, be respectful, talk to people, love everyone, be friends. That's all God requires, whoever your God is. There's a reason why Hindus kill Christians, why Buddhists kill Christians and Hindus, why Muslims kill everyone, and just come up with any permutation or combination you can think of, except for Christians killing anyone. That hasn't happened since the Inquisition. These other faiths and other faith leaders absolutely disagree with this Pope. They may or may not be extremist, but what they all are fundamentalist. They claim a belief system, and they are following it, regardless of how we're always told that all these religions are religions of peace. No, they're literally not. Christianity is. It's yet another thing that makes us different from all the rest. So look, having an interfaith dialogue can be important. It's okay to speak with people of other religions, to respect their freedom, to believe as they choose. It's okay to work with other religions on some things, but not on other things. And we must be very discerning about that. But as for the claim that this Pope made, speaking extemporaneously, which means this is absolutely what he believes, that all religions are paths to God, that we are all God's children, that religions are like languages, different, but all leading to the same end, the Pope is not only wrong, but damningly wrong. Although I've made very clear I don't believe that Catholics, generally speaking, are Christian, are born-again individuals, and I think speaking to any Catholic would verify that. Can you even fathom what difference could be made in this world if the Catholic Church had a Pope that, one, knew his Bible, and two, believed his Bible, and then actually had a spine strong enough to stand for the truth in the Bible? Could you imagine him telling these young people that we can respectfully discuss and disagree about which religion system is correct, but there is no question that either one is right or they're all wrong? And my Bible tells me that Jesus is the only way to get to heaven, to have your sins forgiven, your guilt and shame removed. So although I respect your right to believe as you choose, I must do as my faith commands me and tell you of this gospel, the good news that Jesus came from heaven to earth to be born as a baby, of a virgin, a girl, specifically chosen for that purpose. He grew, he never sinned, he kept all the law perfectly. Then he was wrongly executed on the cross. He died, and after 3 days of lying in a tomb, he rose again, and he did this for you and for me. He did this because we all sin, we all break God's laws, and we aren't able to pay the penalty for our sin against a perfect holy God. We needed someone to step in, someone who is fully man to be as we are, someone who is fully God to be able to pay the infinite penalty, and someone who is perfect and sinless in all his works, thoughts, and deeds. After his resurrection, he appeared to hundreds of people that ascended to heaven, and he will be coming back, and it seems like it could be very soon. Those who have repented for their sins and expressed true faith in him and him alone will live with him in heaven forever. Guaranteed. No guesswork. Those who have decided to try other religions, try their own way, will not go to heaven, but rather will be sent to hell for all eternity, as that's what it takes for man to try to pay their infinite sin debt. So although we can be respectful, I have to implore you to investigate this claim. Is it true or is it not? Is this Jesus, who we know was a real person, was he telling the truth? Was he a horrible liar? Or was he a lunatic? These are the questions you must answer for yourselves. He could have said something like that, but he didn't. Pope Francis desperately needs our prayers. Catholics the world over desperately need our prayers. That God will open their eyes and rescue them out of a cult that gives no assurance. It gives no hope, no peace, just works and guilt and the hopelessness of never knowing if you've done enough good things to outweigh the bad to just squeak your way into heaven eventually. Oh, what a wasted opportunity. When I say Sipporah, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Probably nothing. If I were to say Zipporah, anything different? Yeah, I'd say for the majority of humanity, not much, right? For a smaller group of people, they might recognize that as a name that seems to be residing in one of the deeper, harder to reach wrinkles of the brain. Well, I'm sorry to say, or I'm happy to say, depending on your point of view, that you've wandered into part 3 of our look at women in the Bible through the eyes of the world, not the eyes of Christians, written about in a series of articles on usnews.com from 2008. Thus far, we've learned that male authority is bad, female empowerment good. That's because man is an unthinking sexual brute. Woman is a deeply contemplative and future-thinking being. We've learned that not even God himself or herself apparently has figured everything out and sometimes needs a woman to correct the direction of his tentative plan. We learned that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was actually the tree of the knowledge of sex and procreation, and Eve, after a prolonged period of thought, finally took the fruit she had received from the snake days before off of her dresser and ate, because she decided having children was more important than eternal life. Man, of course, just wanted sex, so he gobbled that fruit down without thinking. God was disappointed that they tried to cover up what they did rather than being mad at the fact that they, sinned and broke his one rule, and he weepingly sent them out of the garden to grow and mature on their own. A good thing Eve correctly defied God, or, well, you and I wouldn't be here now, would we? Then we learn that Sarah and Hagar were dueling mothers, but were really more cooperative than they were competitive, except for when Sarah decided that Hagar's son Ishmael was competition for her son Isaac as the heir of Abraham's fortune, so she told Abraham to get rid of Hagar, but really Hagar was just a lower-class human, a slave who had no say in the matter of being impregnated by Abraham, being used as a surrogate mother, and really that's what this whole narrative is about, isn't it? Simply a morality tale teaching us about society and how there are those who are considered in and those who are considered out, and those on the outside are simply used and abused by those who are on the inside. And that brings us to Zipporah. Have you figured out who this is yet? You should know she's mentioned in a total of, get ready, three verses out of the over 31,000 in the Bible. So a very prominent individual, quite obviously. Well, if you can't place your finger upon who this is, found on usnews.com, headline, Zipporah may be obscure, but the wife of Moses mattered, with the byline of, quote, the woman who stood up to God. So the headline is correct. Zipporah is obscure, very obscure, 3 verses obscure, in fact, but she did matter. Nothing else. She mattered to her family. She mattered to Moses, mattered to her children. The byline, well, if I had written that seriously, as our author, Ms. Beth Brophy, did, I'd be looking around for lightning, probably. I'm guessing that she did not, however, look around for lightning. Okay, so Zipporah. As the headline mentioned, she's the wife of Moses. She's the daughter of Jethro the priest, who is also named as Reuel, or as we probably pronounce it, Reuel, or something like that, found later in Exodus. Some speculation about that. Does it mean that Moses had multiple wives? Were these 2 different men, 2 different fathers-in-law? I think the best explanation on this one is that Jethro and Reuel are the same person. Either those are 2 names that he went by, possibly the name Jethro is actually a title, not a name. There's a number of names in the Bible that we use as names, but are likely titles, so this wouldn't be a massive shocker if that's the case. There is speculation that Moses did take a second wife later, a Cushite woman. We know that he married a Cushite woman. Zipporah wouldn't have fit the description of a Cushite, at least not without a lot of geographical wrangling. And when this Cushite woman is mentioned, she's mentioned in the context that Aaron and Moses' sister Miriam weren't happy with his marriage to this Cushite, but that would have been a long time after he married Zipporah, so that context wouldn't make sense. The speculation is that Zipporah had died by this time and Moses took a wife, but it's possible that he took a second wife later, right? Culturally and historically, that wouldn't have been out of the realm of possibility. But back to Zipporah. She's mentioned the 3 times after all. The first time is in Exodus 2:21, after Moses ran away from Egypt to the land of Midian, where he ended up working for Jethro, or Reuel, and he was given Zipporah, one of Jethro's daughters, as a wife. The second time she's mentioned is in Exodus 4, an odd side story, really, as Moses was returning to Egypt after God appeared to him at the burning bush, heading back to Egypt to do signs from God for Pharaoh in order to convince him to let his people go serve him, even though God told Moses that he was going to harden Pharaoh's heart so he wouldn't let the Israelites go. And Moses took his wife and his sons with him, and when they stopped on the way to Egypt, quote, "Now it happened at the lodging place on the way that Yahweh encountered him and sought to put him to death. Then Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin and touched his feet with it, and she said, 'You are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me,' so he let him alone. At that time she said, 'You are a bridegroom of blood,' with reference to the circumcision." We'll come back to that one. And then she's mentioned one more time in Exodus 18. At some point prior, Moses sent Zipporah and his sons with her back to her father, Jethro, or Reuel. In Exodus 18, Jethro brought Zipporah and Moses' sons with him as he went to visit with Moses in the wilderness. This is where Jethro told Moses that he simply could not keep being the judge of everything and everyone. He's going to burn himself out, and he should designate a hierarchical structure of judges to take care of at least the majority of the disputes. Now, then Jethro went back home. But it doesn't say that Zipporah and Moses' sons went back with him, so it's possible they stayed with Moses in the wilderness, or maybe not. No idea. And that's all. That's Zipporah. So why would someone write an article about Zipporah? Well, the byline combined with one of those 3 accounts pretty much sums it up, doesn't it? Remember, the byline reads, quote, "The woman who stood up to God." I'll let you guess which account fits that one. No, wrong. Not that one. No, not that one either. Look, that one isn't even in the Bible. I don't know where you pulled that one from. No, look, just here. It's the circumcision story. Let me just help you out here. Okay, now I called it an odd story. I'm not a biblical scholar, but Ms. Brophy says, quote, "Bizarre is typical of how biblical scholars describe the tale of Zipporah and her husband, Moses, especially the section in which God attacks Moses and Zipporah uses a blood ritual to successfully defend her husband and son." Okay, well, look. I looked up in my John MacArthur Study Bible app, and right there it was. This story is bizarre. Except, no, it's not exactly true. MacArthur simply lays out the story in the context. But Jonathan Kirsch, author, attorney, and columnist for the LA Times, so you know he's good, says, quote, "For mystery, mayhem, and sheer baffling weirdness, nothing else in the Bible quite compares with the story of Zipporah and the bridegroom of blood." So, who are you gonna believe? MacArthur or Kirsch? Anyway, Ms. Brophy gives a mostly accurate but very abbreviated accounting of Moses killing an Egyptian, running away, protecting Jethro's daughters, marrying Zipporah, having a couple children, God speaking through the burning bush, and Moses heading out to return to Egypt to free his people. And then she doesn't completely hit the ditch, at least not yet, but she sure is sliding and swerving an awful lot. Quote, "During this journey, a strange incident occurs one night in their tent. God tries to kill Moses. Zipporah, somehow sensing that God is angry that their son isn't circumcised, immediately grabs a stone and cuts her son's foreskin. Cutting away the foreskin from the penis is a sign of identification among Hebrews, according to God's covenant with Abraham. Then she flings the bloody foreskin at his feet. Whether his, in the story, refers to God, Moses, or the baby is unclear, and feet may be a stand-in or a euphemism for genitals. Then she says, 'Surely a bridegroom of blood thou art to me.'" Then our author added, quote, reading the crucial passage in its entirety doesn't clear up much. She didn't help much on her own, let me just say that. Now, she somewhat correctly says that even today, there isn't a perfectly clear understanding of what exactly was going on here. I mean, look, this entire account is 3 verses long. I'm not sure we should make much out of it except for a very plain reading of the text. But as she says, this apparently did the trick because Moses wasn't killed by God, and he went on to free the Israelites from slavery. So what happened here? Well, the text tells us that Zipporah took a flint and cut off her son's foreskin. Which one? No idea. He had both Gershom and Eleazar at this time. We know because before setting out to go back to Egypt, we're told that Moses took his wife and sons. We don't know if this is the older or the younger. It would probably make more sense that it was the younger, but that's complete assumption. And why Moses had circumcised one and not the other? Again, no idea. We also know that Zipporah was likely not a follower of Moses' God. Remember, her father was the priest of Midian, where they would have worshipped, where she would have worshipped, and she would have worshipped something, I don't know, but not Yahweh. In the third mention of Zipporah in Exodus 18, when Jethro brought her and the 2 boys to Moses in the wilderness, we're told that Moses recounted all that had happened and all the ways that Yahweh had afflicted Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and all that had happened during their time in the wilderness. And Jethro responded, quote, "Blessed be Yahweh, who delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all the gods, for in this matter they acted presumptuously against the people." So Jethro, to this point, it appears at least, considered Yahweh to be one of the many gods, and although he still might have had that same theory, he at least now acknowledged that this Yahweh appeared to be the highest and strongest of any of the gods that he thought he knew of. So, backing up to Exodus 4, Zipporah would have grown up following her father's lead in worshiping various gods, and although she may have tolerated Moses' belief systems, it's highly unlikely she was, all in at this point. Now, one of the big questions. How did she know that this lack of circumcision was why God was going to put Moses to death? Now, this is very complex. You have to carefully look at the context and the definitions of the Hebrew words as well as the Hebrew construction of these sentences, at which point it's quite clear that we have no idea. Was she given a vision by God? Was there an audible voice? Was Moses told and he told her? To be honest, as interesting as it would be to know this, and one day, those who are born again will likely be able to ask this question, it really doesn't matter. The important part is that this was apparently clear to Zipporah that this child's lack of circumcision was the issue at hand. Now, our author said that, quote, "Cutting away the foreskin from the penis is a sign of identification among Hebrews according to God's covenant with Abraham." And yes, the second part of that sentence is correct. This was according to God's covenant with Abraham, but she neglects to say that this was a sign of the covenant, not simply an identification thing between God and his chosen people per the covenant. Quote, "But an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." See, that quote comes from the Bible. That's where we should probably get, our information. So the term cut off could mean that he was out of the covenant promise, or it could mean that his life was forfeit. So was God going to put Moses to death for his son not being circumcised? Yeah, sure appears that he was. Moses neglected to fulfill his duty. It wasn't the baby's fault, or maybe he was a toddler at that time. Either way, it wasn't his fault. This was Moses' responsibility that he had neglected. Now, I asked the question, which son was this? And I said there's no way for us to definitively know. My guess, as I said, is that this was the younger Eleazar, and since the Midianites wouldn't have practiced circumcision, I would think that the only way Zipporah would know how this was done would be that she had seen it done already. It would make logical sense that she saw Moses do this to Gershom, and at least knew what to do, and sort of maybe why to do it, although she clearly didn't like it. Then we're told that she touched his feet, and maybe that was a euphemism for genitals. So first, no, it's not a euphemism. It's literally feet. But whose feet? Was it the child? Was it Moses' feet? Was it God's feet? I think we can safely assume that God wasn't manifested as a theophany or Christophany and standing there. That really kind of makes no sense. I also think we can rule out that she touched the child's feet with it based on what she said. She wasn't saying, "You are indeed a bridegroom of blood to me," in a blessing way, in a way that showed their bond was now that much stronger. No, it's fairly agreed in various commentaries that she was disgusted by this bloody, obviously painful ritual that Moses' God demanded. It's probably Moses' feet, right? I mean, that would make the best sense of the story. Then we're told that Yahweh left Moses alone. So although not adhered to the way it was supposed to be, the covenant was fulfilled and God was satisfied. We know nothing else about this interesting little interlude in Exodus 4, but that's not stopping those who don't really care for the Bible as written or the interpretations of those in either mainstream Judaism or mainstream Christianity. They see far more than we do, and far more than is actually possible based off of this tiny rabbit trail, for lack of a better term, knowing that the Holy Spirit didn't inspire rabbit trails, that every word in the Bible is there for a specific reason. So she states that there are many mysteries in this tale, and yes, I just addressed most of her questions, but for the record, Your Honor, she asks, quote, "Why did Zipporah, a woman, perform the circumcision? Which son was involved? Was God himself the attacker, or did he send one of his minions? Why did Zipporah and Moses separate? Is the Cushite or Ethiopian wife of Moses referred to in the text Zipporah or another woman?" I think we've at least discussed all but one question of why did they separate. I'd assume that Moses sent her and the boys back home where they'd be safe from a variety of potential dangers. Again, it's just a guess on my part. But my favorite, and I'm sure you can guess, quote, "Was God himself the attacker, or did he send one of his minions?" Hilarious, right? Minions. I mean, hilarious in a blasphemous way, right? Like God is some sort of Dr. Evil, or maybe slightly better, a Gru kind of character, and he's got a bunch of little babbling yellow angels up there to do his bidding. Back to our attorney columnist author, he says that the main message of the story is clear. Quote, "The lesson the Bible intends is that God insists on circumcision as the essential symbol of the covenant of his chosen people. God is even willing to murder for failure to comply. He'll even kill Moses after recruiting him on his liberation mission. That's how important circumcision is to God." So, no, not exactly. It was important, but as a command to adhere to, as a sign of the covenant with his chosen people. But we also learn in the New Testament, at least the New Testament for sure, that circumcision is no longer a mandatory sign of anything. In fact, it's a circumcision of the heart, a sign of God's new covenant with his people through the blood of Christ that's important now. No, at the time, and I've already said this, the command was to circumcise the males or to be cut off. Kirsch is a bit crass when he said that God is even willing to murder for failure to comply, but that's apparently the penalty. And if God was going to have Moses literally be God to Aaron, speaking to Aaron what God spoke to him, Moses is going to be held to the law as it was written at the time, and the law as he would be given during the wandering as well. As for God killing Moses, even though he just called him, I kind of think God had this figured out. It's going to be fine. Kirsch goes on to say that the entire fate of Israel rested with Zipporah. Yes, Moses was great in his importance, but if it wasn't for Zipporah stepping in and circumcising their son, it would have been all over. He says, quote, "She, the pagan daughter of a priest, stood up to God." No, that's literally the exact opposite of what she did. She quickly complied with God's law, even though she didn't like it or likely fully understand it. That's what she did. God was not focused on killing Moses just to kill him, beyond the fact that God is our creator and owner and literally has the right to do anything he wants to us. He had absolute cause to execute Moses because Moses had failed to comply with a law that had that penalty. And clearly, if God wanted Moses dead, Moses would have died right there. But it was communicated somehow that this was regarding circumcision of a son, meaning he was giving them the opportunity to make it right. If Zipporah actually stood up to God, she would have told God that she didn't like it, didn't agree with it, wasn't going to participate in this bloody ritual, and go pound sand. But that's not what she said or did. She did what she was told. She expressed anger with Moses, but did not stand up to God. And maybe, based on the reaction of Zipporah, maybe she had forbidden Moses to circumcise this second child after seeing what happened on the first, and Moses gave in to her demand, so God commanded Zipporah to perform the circumcision. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here. Kirsch goes on to describe Zipporah as, quote, decisive, fearless, strong, the competent person in an emergency, while he describes Moses as, quote, hapless, a total shirker, full of arguments about why he shouldn't be the one to go to Israel and lead his people out of slavery. And I gotta wonder to myself, does Kirsch read what he writes? Did he actually go back, read those words, compare it to the biblical account, and say, yeah, it seems about right? What a dope. First of all, Zipporah may have been that kind of a woman, but we can't get that from this single biblical account, nor can we get that from the Bible at all. Decisive? She didn't make a decision. She did what she was told. Fearless? She did something she clearly didn't like because she was afraid of God that he was going to kill her husband and the father of her children. Strong? Again, it took no strength to do as you were commanded out of fear. Competent in an emergency? Well, nothing in this account says that. We don't know if this was an emergency as such. We have no idea if there was any discernment on her part or any thought process at all. It seems she just did as she was commanded. As for Moses, yes, Moses was full of excuses. Shocker, he's human. I'd suggest that Kirsch put himself in Moses' sandals and let's see how he does. Having run from an entire nation, one of, if not the most powerful nation in the known world, being told through a burning bush that was on fire but didn't burn up by the voice of God himself to head back there and tell the top guy what he's going to do. And to do that knowing that he doesn't speak well anyway. I would imagine that Kirsch would have wet him, wetter than he's ever wet them at any time in his past. It's very easy to fault Moses for his weaknesses, the Hebrews for their failings, the Israelites for their idolatry later on, but if we step back and look at our lives and what we do today, I dare say that at best we would have failed that badly. Kirsch is a big-talking blowhard. That's what I'm trying to say. We should be thanking God just constantly that he chooses to use the weakest, the smallest, the imperfect, to not just carry out his plan, but to be his children in the first place. Moses is just one of so many in the Bible that illustrates that God uses humans, simple, sinful, weak, fickle humans. He loves his children despite our weaknesses. Our illustrious author then turns to a professor of religious studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln named Sidney White Crawford, and Sidney is spelled Sidnie, which shouldn't matter, but let's be honest, it does. It does. So our girl Sid says, quote, to me, the main point is to show that the deity is not all benign. It can be dangerous for humans to be in the presence of God unless they follow religious prescriptions, such as circumcision. Okay, so question, who said God was benign? The deity is never portrayed as hands-off in the Bible. Like, never. In fact, that's the argument between Calvinism and Arminianism, right? It's a matter of how involved is God. But neither theological view says that God is hands-off. As for God being dangerous if we don't follow his laws, well, yeah, he's God, we're not. He's the creator, we're the created. He's the master, we're the slave. He's the owner, we're the possession. He's the rule maker, we're supposed to be the rule follower. God is merciful, yes, but God is just. In fact, if you want to know how not benign God is, how seriously he takes following his rules, may I present to you his son, Jesus Christ. For the elect, God took out his full justice for our failure at adhering to his rules on his son. For the unsaved, that justice will be administered in hell for all eternity. I'd say that God takes his religious prescriptions fairly seriously. Have these people ever read the Bible? Don't worry, though. Sidney has another theory if you didn't like that one. Quote, the story may also be saying that marriage to foreigners can be a good idea and work out well, and that within the family structure, women may be more active in the religious sphere than men. Like Zipporah, it may be the woman who are responsible for conducting the religious rituals. Aha! So, no, the answer to my question of if these people have read their Bible is no. Now, to me, this is just redonkulous, but honestly, look out for charlatans like this. One of the favorite things to do by so-called pastors and teachers who should not be listened to is to take a very small verse or a very small passage, rip it out of context, and make it into something it's not. Remember the prayer of Jabez? Enlarge my territories and whatnot. It was a massive prosperity scam when you break it down. So, pop quiz. How large was the passage of Scripture that outlined Jabez and his prayer? Two verses. 1 Chronicles 4:9 says that he was more honorable than his brothers and gives us the origin of his name, which means sorrow, because she bore him with sorrow. Then verse 10 is the entire prayer. Quote, "Oh, that you would bless me indeed and enlarge my border, and that your hand might be with me, and that you would keep me from harm, that it may not pain me." And God apparently honored that request. So obviously all we need to do is pray that and we'll prosper, as long as we're more honorable than all of our brothers, and we were born out of sorrow, and our name is Jabez. And no, this isn't just descriptive text. This is not prescriptive. It's not telling us what to do. It's telling us what happened. And that's the same with the story of Zipporah. It's describing an event. Barely describing an event. It's not telling us what must be done. This isn't overly difficult to figure out, to be honest. But it gets worse. Ms. Brophy moves to author Mark Halter, who created a work of fiction based off of the virtually no information known about Zipporah. Now look, Answers in Genesis has a book trilogy entitled Noah, the Remnant Trilogy, written by Tim Chaffee and K. Marie Adams. These are 3 novels that take the relatively sparse account of a man and an event that are arguably one of the biggest in the entire Bible and the history of the world, and they fluff them out into a story that's just fantastic. I would, without reservation, recommend these books. They're super entertaining, but with the caveat that they are taking massive literary license to try to create a narrative, but with the full intention of keeping biblical accuracy in mind. And it's done very, very well. Sadly, that's not what we get from Mr. Mark Halter, apparently, who incidentally seems to have had quite the life. He's a Polish-born Jew, born in Warsaw in 1936, escaped during World War II to the Soviet Union, later emigrating to France. He's had quite the life, and is credited as being a writer, artist, and human rights activist. Well, he's decided that Zipporah was black. In fact, she is the Cushite, or Ethiopian woman, whom Moses married, even though it seems clear that the Cushite woman was someone much later in Moses' life, presumably after Zipporah had died. But he has an agenda in this work of fiction, so Zipporah must be black, and that would make her the Cushite, or Ethiopian woman. So in his story, Zipporah refuses to marry Moses until he finally gives in and decides that he would do as God told him to do, to go and lead the Israelites out of slavery. He says, quote, "Zipporah is black and a foreigner, and she poses the problem of how we relate to the other. Moses is ignorant, so Zipporah becomes his principal advisor." Well, thankfully Zipporah, this black-skinned outsider, quote, helped Moses fulfill his destiny as a liberator of the enslaved. Now, what Mr. Halter wanted was a story with a strong black woman, so he could make this a slavery narrative and a feminist narrative and a person of color narrative. Basically, no, this is ridiculous. But again, if someone is so inclined, the Bible has so much information and clearly can't give a full accounting of every single event, so someone can take a verse or two horribly out of context and create their own narrative, their own interpretation, their own moral of the story, and sell it to others who want there to be some mystical hidden knowledge inside the Bible that only a few could possibly understand. But this isn't biblical in any way. So, after all that, our author, Ms. Beth Brophy, summarizes that there are many interpretations as to who Zipporah was and wraps up her article with, quote, "Zipporah stays true to her role as a woman who acts bravely and decisively, not one who is acted upon." Except that, no, as I pointed out, that's not actually close to true. Zipporah did as she was told, as God commanded, because I'm inclined to believe she was told by God to do exactly what she did. She acted obediently, even if it was through ignorance or fear. She acted obediently, not bravely, not decisively. Okay, so for us to wrap this up, what do we take from this story and Zipporah in general? Well, from the story in question, we can understand that Moses was not a perfect man. He's not without sin, but God used him in his plan, and in this case, a major part of the history of the world. But God also requires obedience. If I may be permitted to pull a phrase from Galatians out of context of that passage, do not be deceived, God is not mocked. Now, what would it have said to the children of Israel if their hand-picked, God-ordained leader was slack in his keeping of the covenant, one of the very few commands that God had given his children at this point in history? Although we have about, 1% of the story, we ultimately learn that God must be obeyed. Thank, literally God, that for us in the new covenant, Jesus lived that perfect life for us, because you and I fail daily. Overall, what should we take from the life of Zipporah? Well, ultimately, nothing. I mean, look in part 1 of this little mini-series. I made it clear that when women are written about in the Bible, especially by name, we should pay careful attention. In this case, she was the daughter of Jethro, a pagan priest, a wife to Moses, a mother to Gershom and Eleazar. She was given to Moses as a wife. At some point, she was sent back with the boys to live with her father, and later she and the boys were brought back to Moses in the wilderness and may or may not have stayed with him after that. She played a role in a specific incident, and that's all. Anything other than what's written in those very few verses is pure speculation, and anything that speculates outside of or contradictory to what we know from the rest of the Bible is basically humanist garbage. So as with the other parts so far, what we see are unsaved humans wanting to craft a narrative to fit an agenda. That is not what we are to do with the Bible, but we shouldn't be surprised when the unsaved world treats the Bible in an unsaved way. The title of the article said that Zipporah was obscure, but she mattered, and I totally agree. She mattered. She mattered to her family, she mattered to God, but not in the way the godless world wants her to matter. This is just one of so many examples of why we must act as Bereans, be ever discerning, meditating on the scriptures, verifying that what we're being told is what we should believe. Far too many people are willing to compromise their own integrity and compromise the scriptures to try to gain some sort of notoriety, posing as a person who's been granted some sort of double secret hidden wisdom. Those are people we should not be listening to. Okay, next time we're going to dive into the, quote, wife, mother, queen, object of royal lust, Bathsheba. Until then, go read your Bible. Well, somehow we've made it to Danny's book review, installment number 7. Yes, it should be number 8, but if you recall, there was no book review the last time it was due because, me readed badly back then. So from a pages standpoint, I'm sitting at 3,263 pages read out of my goal of 4,500, which puts me at 72.5% of my goal thus far for the year. To be at my goal pace, I have to be at 75% of that page goal by the end of September, and it's going to be tight. We've had some big audits at work, plus some other issues I've had to attend to, and so that kind of screws up the reading at lunch thing. I've had some late night cubby games, meaning I'm not getting reading done at night. It's just kind of been a slog here the last few months. That's all I'm trying to say. At the end of June, I was at 63% of my goal, way ahead of my needed pace. And in the last, 10 weeks, I've accomplished less than 10% more of that goal. That's not good. But that's what goals are for. 4,500 pages, admittedly, was, by the numbers, it looked to be a slightly ambitious goal, although it really didn't seem like it was that ambitious based on the first half of the year. So now we're slowing down, and apparently it is more ambitious than it appeared. Anyway, today I've got one book to review, and this book, it just took me forever to get through it. I'm not sure why, to be honest. It's slightly bigger than a typical book, like page, height and width, or length and width, or whatever you want to call it. It's dense reading, but really it's not really that much different. It was just slow. It's really slow going. So the book is entitled The Remarkable Wisdom of Solomon, written by Henry M. Morris. Henry Morris died in 2006 at the age of 87. He was a staunch young earth creationist. He was obviously an author, and he was an engineer, which is probably why I generally like his writing style. So in this book, Morris takes us through all the attributed books of Solomon, first the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, then the Proverbs, then Ecclesiastes. And it was... Well, look, I'll be honest. I've read I believe 2 of his other books about specific individuals in the Bible, and I've really enjoyed them. This one was not my favorite. I think my biggest problem with this book is the massive number of assumptions that he's making. I mean, there's a lot we don't know about Solomon. There's a lot of what that we do know, but there's not a lot of why. We know that he wrote the sexiest book in the Bible. We know that he wrote a massive number of Proverbs. We know that he was the wisest man in history because God asked him what he wanted. Just make your request, it'll be yours. And Solomon asked for wisdom to be able to rule God's chosen people. We know that later in Solomon's life, he went off the rails. He had, like 700 wives and 300 concubines, and I mean, what the heck do you even do with that? We know that he erected idols in high places and followed all those foreign wives in the worship of their various gods. And that was after he erected the grandest temple to Yahweh God of all. We know that the interpretation of Ecclesiastes seems to vary from person to person. But Morris tries to fill in the gaps for us. He tries to link things that I'm not sure that we can link. It has to be hundreds upon hundreds of times that Morris used some word or phrase that implies assumption as he tried to make a point. Now, granted, a large number of them are logical assumptions. I see how he gets there, and he's probably right on a number of them. But the book, it just got really frustrating to me because it wasn't like his others. I don't remember. It's been a while since I read them, but I don't remember him doing that in the other books, not to this extent. This wasn't a fact-based book so much as it was facts scattered amongst assumptions. And even more, assumptions that were stated to be assumptions earlier in the book were later recalled in, later parts of the book for whatever point he was making, but now they're kind of treated as fact. It was almost comical. Almost. But it definitely made it a not fun read for me, but I got through it. Now, beyond that, I found it humorous that Morris appeared to be a complete abolitionist or prohibitionist as it pertains to alcohol. A number of times in those 3 books, wine or strong drink was referenced, sometimes in a positive light, sometimes negative. If the reference was negative, Morris was right on board. If it was positive, then it was grape juice. No alcohol content, because of course it couldn't have alcohol in it. I mean, sorry, Henry, but you're wrong. You're just wrong. We can argue the amount of alcohol, but you're wrong. As a positive, he did walk through each of the books slowly and carefully, working through the connections both inside each book and between the books. He grouped the Proverbs together and discussed them logically, which I appreciated. Now, I don't agree with his theological view of Ecclesiastes. I happen to be more of the opinion that Solomon died as an apostate, that he rejected God in pursuit of earthly happiness, and even if he figured out that he wasted however much of his life it was, he never actually repented. I'm of the opinion that he was not the author of the introduction or the ending of the book, that someone else tacked those on there. Now, Morris is of the opinion that Solomon went through this rebellious phase, if you will, and found his way back, repenting, etc., etc. I don't know. I just don't see it. I've heard pastors teach on it both ways. I just think the apostate interpretation more accurately represents what the text is saying. Furthermore, and this is an argument from absence, I grant you that, we don't find Solomon in the Hall of Faith in the book of Hebrews. Now, not every Old Testament figure of faith is in there, but look, Samson, who was one of the most wayward people, a Nazirite and a judge no less, who absolutely did his own thing for his entire life, is mentioned in Hebrews 11 in the Hall of Faith. David and Samuel are both in there, but Solomon isn't. I think that says something, but that's just assumption. And didn't I just argue that that's a bad thing? Shh, don't say anything. Anyway, would I recommend the book? That's really the question, right? Now, look, this is a 248-page book with probably that many, if not more, assumptive phrases inside those pages. Now, he does put the biblical text in the book, not just references or a few words, but all of it, passage by passage, which is nice, but he's a KJV guy, and although I can read the KJV, I don't really like to do it. I want to focus on the text, not trying to figure out what the word is trying to pretend it is. So I pulled up a Bible app and I read the passages in the LSB. That's purely a preference thing. So would I recommend it? Well, as much as I feel like I'm betraying a fellow engineer and a fellow young earth creationist, I'd have to say no. I'm not saying it's a bad book. There's a lot of good in there, but if you're like me, you'll be no more than 10, 15, 20 pages in before you start feeling like nothing is real, man. And you won't like that feeling. It doesn't get better. It just gets worse. I've read his books on Jonah and Job, and I would absolutely recommend them. From what I remember, those were excellent. There were assumptions, but not to this extent. And I know of a few of his other books, and I've heard very good things about those, although I haven't read them. But this one, I'm just not sure that reading this one brought me a lot of benefit, and I'm not sure it's going to bring other people a lot of benefit. That's all I'm saying. And with that, I guess that's all there is for Danny's book review installment number 7. If you're interested, the link for the book is in the notes as always. So with that, go read something. And with that, sadly, we've reached the end of yet another episode of the Logical Christian Podcast. I feel we've bonded as we've laughed and cried and twisted our faces in incredulity. If you've enjoyed or found value in what you've heard, go on and do all the podcast things. And don't forget to check the show notes for links and contact info. Lawrence J. Peter said, "Against logic there is no armor like ignorance." Jesus told us that if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So stay in the word, stay logical, stay faithful, and until next time, God bless.